Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is, wherever you might be. My name's JP. Welcome back to the 425 show. Yet another action-packed, exciting episode of the 425 show. I'm joined today by Ilana Smith, all the way from across the ocean, over in Ireland. So, good evening to you, or good afternoon to you, Ilana. How are you?
I am great, JP. Thanks for inviting me to come and chat. And I'm only over
Yeah,
the ocean and you're where you are.
I guess it's true. I guess if somebody's beyond too far the other way, I guess it depends on which direction they're coming from. But you're in the ocean for me. I'll say that. But at least I'm really close to the ocean. Although right now I'm close to a lake because we're in Michigan visiting some family. So there's a huge lake, which my children believe is an ocean, and then they get upset and they say, "Why aren't there any waves in this ocean?" So they're not big fans of the lake ocean. So, but
And it's a
they're little enough that they
freshwater
get away
lake,
with it.
right?
Yeah, they're huge lakes, but they don't really have any
Incredible.
waves.
Yeah. I'm Australian. We don't have that amount of fresh water. I can't even believe that Lake Washington in Seattle is freshwater. That amount of fresh water doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's a little weird. The beaches are very rocky too. They have lots of stones. It's not sandy like you're not going to build any sandcastles on these lake beaches. So, but that's okay because it's also like 70 degrees and it's super cold to be going and getting in any sort of frigid ice fresh water. So we'll just take what we can get.
You need to come here
Um,
to Ireland where people go swimming in the sea year round. And again, as an Australian, that's against my religion. I think that unless the water is basically warmer than the air, you shouldn't be in it. But people go out there not even wearing wetsuits. They have these special things, which seems to be kind of like a fleece meets a raincoat. It's called a dry robe, which they put,
mhm.
as far as I can tell, they put on over themselves when they come out of the sea to stop them turning into an icicle instantly. I think that
Mm.
if you have to have special garments, it's an activity you probably shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, it seems a little extreme. I don't know about year round. I mean, so I live on a lake at home back in North
Mhm.
Carolina, but it's a fake lake. It was made to cool a nuclear station. So while you can sleep in it or swim in it year round, not entirely sure you'd want to. I mean, maybe I guess
Does it
if you're
have the
interested
little
in,
three-eyed fish like from The
yeah,
Simpsons?
exactly, yeah. So if you're into 3 and 4 eyed fish, you can go swimming all year long. I don't know what that does to your children if they swim in it for too long. So we just tend to stay away from it. But
I don't know. Extra eyes
um,
good at times.
yeah, I mean, I did have a friend of mine, and poor guy, his eyes would go opposite directions, so he kind of looked like a two-eyed fish anyway. But maybe he swam too much in the lake. I don't know. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about workload identities, and
Yeah.
um, so I left for a little bit. I used to be here for a few years, and then I got bored, I guess, and I left. I went to go work at a startup. That didn't work out so well, and so I came back. And when I
Hmm.
came back, everybody started talking about workload identities, and they said, "Well, this is a thing. This is a big thing." And I'm really curious, sort of, what are they? Like, where do we even begin with what a workload identity actually is?
Oh, it's a fantastic question and one of my favorite things to explain. Okay, so in identity systems, we have a couple of different types of identities. And I think the ones that we talk about most of the time are people, right? So it's mostly, frankly, in AAD when we're talking about them, we're usually talking about like employees, right? But there's also customers, there's also partners. There are identities who represent a human. But these are not all of the identities that are in our system. There's a whole bunch of identities in our system that aren't people, that are non-human identities. They also get called machine identities. And there's two big categories there. So there's devices. Servers, laptops, IoT devices start to get really interesting because they often operate on their own and can do interesting stuff. Um,
Yeah.
you know, so device identities, and we have functionality in Azure AD to help you understand those, control them, put policy on them. Then there is essentially identities for software, bots, services, apps, VMs, which are pretending to be devices but are actually software. Um, uh, RPA, depending on whether it's pretending to be a human or pretending to be software. So it's essentially identities for software. And these didn't really have a commonly used name. Sometimes I guess service accounts sort of it models it a bit. In Azure AD, we have service principals and application objects, which are essentially workload identities. That's what we represent workload identities as. But workload identity seems to be the term in the industry that's gaining a bit of traction. It's the one Gartner uses when they're defining the machine identity space. Our friends at Google have been using it, and in a vastly new mode for Microsoft, we are electing to take on where the industry is going rather than trying to invent our own name for something and field of dreamsing it. Yeah, I mean, it's the identity of software. And if you purely think about the world in terms of Azure Active Directory, then we're talking about application objects and service principals. And frankly, most of the time we're talking about service principals, because service principals are the things that you do access management on and can get out there and do interesting, potentially harmful stuff. It makes sense?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think so.
It's nothing new, right? It's just like it's sort of category, and like the stuff we're doing with them is new.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's an important thing, though, because so many times we talk to customers and we build things ourselves and we say it will do that. We're not sure if it's supposed to do that because the people who made it weren't really expecting it to do that thing. So maybe it'll do that thing right now, but it's not going to do it forever. And so I think the perspective shift is a good.
Yeah,
it's a good shift for us.
Yeah, start talking about it. Start talking about, hey, we're interested in enabling more scenarios where you can use the identities that you already have, enabling reuse of these identities, helping you understand the life cycle of these identities. Because frankly, it's easy to understand people, right? I see them. If I were in the office, I would walk past them in the hallway. When I look up the financial statement of my company, it says how many employees I have. I probably have a decently good idea about how many customers I have, or I probably don't know how many partners I work with, but it's a piece of knowledge I could get. Whereas, and these things have life cycles too, right? So a partner is onboarded by your procurement or your finance or whatever type of partner it is. They go through some sort of certification. An employee is hired. They move around from one role to another, and then they leave the company in some way. And so it's easy. It's easier. It's not easy, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't all have jobs. It's easier to understand things like the life cycle, the total population size, appropriate behaviors of people. Whereas software identity, workload identities, they're much more difficult to understand. You don't really know how many you have. You're not really sure what they're up to. And the scary bit is it's an attack surface as well, right? These things have access to stuff. These things can cause damage. These things can be used to steal data, to elevate privilege, all sorts of things like that. And the bad people have noticed.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that if we were to go look and say any one of our Azure AD like tenants or directories, we'd have some number of users, and I would imagine an exponentially higher number of apps and service principals, right? It seems
absolutely.
It seems pretty common.
Yeah, and we're expecting it to get bigger too, right? So, I mean, it really there isn't some reliable maths on this, right? I think we're seeing something like, I think it's, you probably have somewhere around 5x the number of workload identities of people, and we're expecting it to grow to 20x or more over time. Like, obviously, more and more stuff's moving to the cloud. Organizations are doing more and more stuff. They're digitally transforming, and so like these are exponentially growing. But there isn't some sort of maths. It really depends on the profile of your organization. Maybe you're an application development house, in which case you probably have a zillion of these things. Whereas, a different profile of company might have a different multiplier. But yeah, you have lots of them. You probably don't understand them very well. You probably have more of them than you have of users. Many of them are potentially very highly privileged just based on the nature of what they're doing, right? They're accessing your customer database. They're your admin tool, right? Many of them are incredibly highly privileged. And then you've got, and you also want to enable lots of really core scenarios. You want to enable your employee or your customer or your partner to be able to consent applications in to enable scenarios. And so there's lots of ways these things can get into your organization, and add incredible value or behave badly.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say if we were to go look at like all of the Azure docs even for the last 10 years, I mean, how many Azure product docs start with, okay, in order to do this, you need to go create a service principal, go run this command. Now you've got your service principal to go do your deployment or to deploy your resources or to run something or something else. And sort of by nature, because there's no user involved, it's very difficult to sort of scope what these things have access to a specific user. But it ends up being very sort of, I can read all mailboxes, I can read all calendars, etc. Because I don't have a specific user to attach.
Yeah, and you know what? Some of them are really short-lived, right? So I spun up a thing that did a thing one day, and I've never done anything since. And it's sat there. It's sat there with access. It's sat there as potentially attack surface, doing nothing. Or maybe I continue to use it. It's incredibly valuable. And if someone were to accidentally turn it off, maybe my business grinds to a halt. Even fundamental things like, with a user, everyone mostly has a manager, right? So, well, first of all, with the users, you can go and call someone up or email someone and say, what the hell? Do you still need this access? Is this still a thing? Hey, you still have access to marketing stuff and you're now in sales. Can I remove that, right? There is at least some level of manual attestation-y sort of behavior you can do. With software identities, with workload identities, it's like many of these things we just sort of presume with users aren't necessarily there and are much more difficult to understand. And so, there's a lot of scope for us to help you understand your population better and to govern it better, to have better curation on it, to reduce your attack surface, to put basic controls in place so that bad stuff is less likely to happen. There's just a whole lot of opportunity there. And then, work we can also do to expand out the places that you can use the ones that are valuable to you.
Well, I think the Lifecycle seems to be the one that seems to be a really big one that a lot of people get in trouble with, because Lifecycle is so much of a human process as well as a technical one. Years and years ago, I did when I was doing cloud consulting, I went to a customer, and huge big customer. They ran grocery stores and stuff. But one of the things that was really interesting was the guy we were working with. He said, "Watch this," and he logged into a VM that was 9 years old. It was Windows 2000. He logged into this Windows 2000 server. He said, "I got this on my first project here." And because they had a very well-defined, long-running process for getting resources turned on, it took them, 4 months to get this VM. But nobody ever knew it was his. Nobody ever knew it was his to call him and say, "Do you still need this thing anymore?" Yeah. And so the default was, well, let's just keep it running and continue to add capacity. And while, of course, it's not an identity, I mean, it's still this resource, and it's still a resource that's sitting there running and costing money and is an attack surface and everything else.
And everyone's nervous to turn it off, right? Because what happens if our entire business grinds to a halt?
Right. Yeah. Nobody wants to be that guy that turned it off. And the people who are big enough in the org to not get fired for turning off the wrong thing, they don't know how to turn them off anymore, because that's why they're the big bosses. So they're not down there turning off VMs. So what kind of because I know we have a lot of sort of lifecycle bits for users, and a lot of ways to manage what users can do and how they access things and under what conditions certain things happen. Yeah. So are you alluding to the fact that maybe we'll get some of that for service principals too?
Maybe we will. Yeah. So Azure Active Directory, right? We've built a bunch of functionality to help you manage, govern, secure users, right? And that, the big one, obviously, conditional access, that allows you to set the conditions under which an identity can get access to something. Hey, you can't access our finance app unless you're on the corporate network and you're on a managed device, kind of stuff, right? Really fundamental, basic controls, as well as, some of the more intelligent stuff where our identity protection functionality, it says, hey, you look risky for some reason, right? Based on all of our modeling and everything, you look a bit suspicious. And so I'm going to say you have to pass a higher bar of proof to say you're all right. These are, it's from a security standpoint. And then with lifecycle management, right, we have ways for you to get access to things, for us to make sure you still need access to things, to change access if you change jobs, and to remove access when you leave. We have all this functionality for users, and that's, you know, that's what a lot of the Azure Active Directory product is. And so what's really exciting about the work that we've been doing is essentially taking that set of functionality and saying, well, what if it's not a person? What if we, you know, if we take a lot of that really awesome functionality and sort of stretch it out sideways so that it covers new classes of identities? And many of the problems are similar, not exactly the same. The behavior patterns are different and things like that, but there's corollaries in a lot of ways. And so that's the set of functionality we're building right now. It's called Microsoft Entra Workload Identities, because we have the new umbrella brand, Microsoft Entra. And it's essentially taking a lot of that Azure AD Premium capabilities and building a version of it that is appropriate for these workload identities. And so the three big ticket features that come along, and they're all in preview right now, so people can go out, use them. They're all, you know, in preview, they're all free, everything like that. The first one is conditional access for workload identities. And this allows you to set two conditions at the moment. The first condition is IP range. And that immediately cuts down a huge amount of attack surface, because if you say, hey, look, that piece of software can only access my resource if it's coming from a particular IP range, that really limits your attack surface. It can't come from some country where you're not running your software. The second condition is risk-based. So if we assess based on our various models, you know, offline research, that kind of stuff, that there's something risky going on, then you can say, nah, you can't have access. So that's conditional access. Second thing is identity protection. So essentially that whole piece driving the risk-based conditional access, which is a bunch of research, a bunch of policies, a bunch of ML around, is this a risky access? And then the third piece is access reviews. So we have capabilities that allow you to do access reviews where service principals are assigned to privileged roles. So you can come along and run a campaign where you go and assess, and does this thing still need access? And so they're the big three things. And then there's lots of opportunities, I think, to look at all of our functionality, whether it's in conditional access, identity protection, and we'll continue to add on over time.
Well, and right as you started talking about it, someone in the chat mentioned, like, can we do things like this app may only log in from this IP, and locations are essentially IP ranges at this point, yeah. Right? In addition to physical countries, locations, etc. But I could also have my own IP ranges that say this is my corp network or this is my whatever network, only allow from here.
Yeah, in Azure AD you can essentially, I think we call it, unless we've changed the name recently, I think we call it named locations, where you can essentially designate, hey, this is my corpnet, this is where I run another thing, this is my corpnet in for my French subsidiary, that sort of stuff. And so you can essentially designate it, and then you can use these ranges in your policies.
Ah, very cool. Okay. And on top of that, then, so we sort of have a set of protection through risk, through risk protection, identity protection, where we are evaluating the, you know, how suspicious or how non-suspicious a certain login might be.
Mm-hmm.
We can use that in conditional access to, say, block a login, for example.
Yeah. So for example, so if a particular workload has highly privileged stuff, maybe you say, hey, if it's got medium risk, don't let it in at all. But maybe for low privileged stuff, you're like, hey, only on high risk block.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So it is not a hammer in search of a nail. It's a little bit more finesse.
Yeah, and it really depends on the risk posture of your company, right? If you're super risk averse, then you're like, hey, if there is even the slightest sniff of a bit of risk, block.
Yeah. Okay. And then lastly, we've got essentially the sort of auditing and remediation in the sense of with access reviews. So we can go back and see who's got access where, including these service principals, and then remediate that access if appropriate.
Yeah, go through and say, hey, does this thing still really need this access, and remove it if it doesn't. We also have, obviously we have a bunch of fundamental functionality that is just in the product that will remain available. Things like audit logs on service principals and stuff like that help you go through and figure out what's going on and what they're up to and things like that. Because there's attacks like consent phishing, right? Where you can trick someone into consenting an application into your tenant and giving it a bunch of access. And historically, this has been, hey, it pretends to be SharePoint or it pretends to be something, and it looks very innocuous. And you're like, oh, of course, I'm trying to do a thing. I'm going to totally consent this into my organization, and it turns out to be a bad app. And it does bad stuff. Or, a compromised user might introduce bad application identities into your system, which then go on and do further bad things inside. And if you are able to set some of these policies, just protecting against really, just like fundamental conditions, then that reduces your attack surface significantly.
Yeah, I think what we've seen in the past is we've had customers sort of essentially go really far to one side and say, okay, nobody can register apps or service principals. No one can consent except for admins. And then their help desks and service desks get totally overloaded. And their admins are, and of course, ergonomically, their developers are like, well, this is miserable. I can't do any of this. So I'm going to go do it somewhere else. And then I'll, come back over. And of course, we all know the fun that brings into organizations when people are doing, shadow dev somewhere else. So
there's other protections in place that we have. Things like, I believe you can set policy that says, hey, if this publisher is verified by Microsoft, then allow them to consent again. And then you can set up a workflow, right, where a user says, I want access to this thing, but it has to go through an admin to approve it. Ideally, you don't need to say just completely turn it off for everyone, because there's very, very useful scenarios you're trying to enable here. But putting the right level of controls for your company's risk posture is helpful.
So beyond the sort of risk side to this, so one of the things you mentioned was, of course, we can do things like location-based blocking. When we talk about like the risk factors here, like how much of that risk is sort of Microsoft determined, and how much of that risk is say customer determined? Like, how much say does a customer get to say that this is high risk? Like, what makes something high risk? Do we publish that information for people to know, or is that private? Is that our special magic sauce?
It is relatively private. I think some of the more obvious conditions, are essentially that algorithms you author in a conditional access policy. But then, like, sort of the dynamic risk assessment that we do is usually based more on the things we're observing going on and the new style of attacks that we see coming. And so, it is in our interest somewhat to keep that relatively obscure or like obfuscated away. Because I think if we make that a little bit too obvious, then it's a little too obvious to work around it, right? And these are models getting published. I believe we do it every day, right? So sometimes we may not be able to describe exactly what's going on and exactly what we're protecting against today, right? So yeah, it's a relatively privileged set of stuff, just based on the nature of the work that we're doing there. But then also too, like we do publish we think this is low risk, we think this is medium risk, we think this is high risk. We do give additional information about why we're making that assessment in certain levels of our offering. If you have that available.
Sorry, could you say that again?
Watch for talking to me for some reason.
No, it's all good. Well, but on that,
things like leaked credentials, for example, for a user. I believe we if we know your username and password is out there floating around, that's high risk, I believe. It should definitely be. And that we certainly publish that as, hey, this is a leaked credentials, and based on this, you need to go and reset your password.
And leaked credentials are that's actually exactly where I was going, which is great. So one of the things we see the most, of course, is I checked my secret into GitHub. I checked my secret into Bitbucket or wherever, and Sometimes people don't even recognize that they've done it until it's far too late. There used to be a website which was fantastic that listed all of these secrets that people were publishing in real time into
Mhm.
GitHub, which was it was very, very interesting to watch. So, from what I understand, we're gonna have some of that type of functionality in here too, right? Because we, of course, service principals are, and those
Yeah.
secrets getting picked in is a common occurrence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's really cool to me is, to basically take a look at all the functionality that we build for users and challenge ourselves, okay, what's the workload identities equivalent of that? And so maybe it's that you use the same username and password for credentials, right? Is you had terrible credential security. You used the same username and password on all sorts of dodgy apps. One of them got compromised, and now they're replaying those against all the valuable things. And look, you just got compromised. So checking your secrets into GitHub is a wonderful example of that's the workload identity equivalent of using the same password in some sort of low security app. And so it's a great example of a place where we're like, well, what's the equivalent, and be able to come along and build that functionality.
And then in addition, now we're looking at things like workload identity federation, or identity federation with workload identity federation. I don't even know what it's called. The specific name is called. I probably should be working in marketing without knowing what all of our stuff's being called. But and so now we can kind of even get rid of credentials altogether for some of these workload identities. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and says, I want to manage some secrets, right? I've worked in, I've been on the identity team for 8 years, and I love to tell people that, I really believe that people only write apps so they've got places to log in. Sort of displaying my biases there, but no, I mean, no one ever wants to manage secrets, and it's terrible, right? Like, that's where we screw up. That's where bad stuff happens. That's where where applications break, is because we've done that badly. And so I think it's really important that as part of our overall strategy, the first thing we're doing is reducing the places where developers need to manage secrets. And with Azure managed identities, that's like sort of our highest level example of that. If you're on Azure using Azure resources, then in most cases you can just use a managed identity and you never have to touch a secret. We take care of all of that for you under the covers. Just do the bit you're getting paid to do, not manage the identities. And so it is. We can reduce the load on developers. We can increase the security of all of our systems if we can continue to expand out the scenarios where individual developers don't have to manage secrets. And Workload Identity Federation is a great example of that, where you can set up a federation. I think GitHub's one of the examples of where we're doing it, where essentially we're trusting an identity that's come. You can set up trust with an identity from another service. You don't have to manage a secret, right? Because the identities talk to each other, and you can just get on with doing the thing you're actually getting paid to do. And it's super interesting to us to continue to expand out those scenarios where you're just using identities that you're using and you're not managing secrets. You're not trying to rotate them. You're not trying to keep track of them. You're not trying to store them securely. You're just building cool apps.
I mean, if we had $1 for every time we had written a secret manager, secret rotator, script app, whatever on this show, even, I don't think any of us would actually still be here. We'd be on a boat somewhere in a giant freshwater lake that's 70 degrees. But
and the number we had $1 for every time the cert had expired and something had broken, we'd have 2 boats on the lake.
Well, and you think too, like, so many of these secrets, it's like, well, I created a secret at exactly 11:42 a.m. on this day, and so you get to work that morning and you think, oh, everything's fine, nothing's happening, and then right before you go to lunch, all hell breaks loose and everything breaks because that specific moment was when that secret expired. So we can't even get down to like the day. The granularity is just way too short.
Yeah. No one ever said I want to spend some time managing certificates.
So if people want to, if we want to start using this today, like, because it's sort of a blanket of feature, or maybe not a blanket, it's sort of an umbrella of lots of different features.
I mean, just like fundamentally, like service principals are there right now, right? They're They've always been there. That's part of the interesting thing here is you already have this problem. Most active tenant already has these problems. They already have these service principals, have all of this access, are potentially vulnerable, and that all of that functionality is still there. We'll continue to build it out, but it's developer functionality. It's available right there. It will continue to be free. And then the specific, like sort of the premium level functionality, conditional access, identity protection, access reviews, that's the stuff that's currently in preview. That's the stuff that's going to be part of this Microsoft Entra Workload Identities offering. It's currently there in the product and people can go and try it out right now.
Ah, very cool. Okay. And I think that was our next question was sort of the licensing. So this is going to be a premium set of features on top of what we already have today. Do we have any idea sort of what that'll be?
Beside. So
beside, okay.
Yeah, so like we license Azure Active Directory Premium, the premium capabilities, not the core auth-in and auth-zed that people are doing, but then the functionality that we build to help you to manage secure and govern at scale. We license those on a per user basis. So, hey, I have 100 employees. I'm going to buy 100 licenses so I can set conditional access policies. They can do self-service reset. I have identity protection, entitlement lifecycle, that kind of stuff. We license that on a per user basis. And so essentially, and then there's Azure Active Directory external identities, where for your customers and your partners, it's more of an activity-based model where we license like them, but then it's a per user basis. And so, and that following that model along, right, is rather than presume you have some certain amount of premium or anything like that, it's more to the side. So based on however many workload identities you have, you should go and get that number of licenses for that functionality. It's really just about stretching that same functionality sideways.
Okay, cool. And then, so people go out and use this stuff today. There's no licensing requirement today because it's still in preview. And then once it goes out of preview, which I'm assuming is going to be a little later this year, then people are going to start paying for it, which presumably they can buy through their Microsoft account reps in the portal.
Yeah, there'll be like a 90-day trial, I think. So like even once we start making it available for purchase, you'll still have the ability to go in and get 90 days to kick the tires and decide if it's something that you want. And then however you acquire your Microsoft software, you will be able to purchase this at the level that you require to. I think one thing that's super interesting is maybe you make the assessment in your organization, hey, I've got a whole bunch of tests, identities, and a whole bunch of stuff I like doesn't access really privileged stuff, but this set of special stuff, like maybe you choose that you're only going to protect that set of identities, and that's the amount that you would buy. We're also, one of the things I'm super excited about, which will come a little bit later, is we're building capabilities to help you understand unused identities. And so we will help you find, hey, this is a set of identities that haven't been active in a while, and maybe what you want to do is go and remove those from your system. So that's going to reduce your attack surface. It's also going to potentially reduce the number of identities you need to buy a license for as well. So it's kind of like, do your garden and get everything cleaned up, and then you've got this sort of at a runtime to keep you safe.
And is it one SKU, or they're like, because we have P1, P2, for example, for users, like, is it going to be a P1, P2 style thing, or 1 or 2 or 10 or 40 or?
We're mostly really talking about one. Okay. It's sort of kind of at the P2 level. We've priced it pretty low so that you can expand it out. Like, we really, really want people to get out there protecting these. So I mean, talk to whoever you purchase this from, but it's less than the amount you pay for users. But again, like so much of the value comes from the intelligence and helping you understand that population, that the really interesting value is in things, is in the functionality that helps you like really do that analysis, find out, hey, where's the risk of this population I don't understand very well? What's the lifecycle management of this population that I don't understand very well? And that sort of aligns with the P2 level for users.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. Well, That's pretty neat. I mean, I'm sort of excited to try it. I know we've got a whole month, or the next few weeks we're all slated to do lots of different things related to workload identity, and I think even one of the things I was thinking, just even through us talking, is I think I'm going to go check a few secrets into GitHub and see how long it is before I get a notification that I've got a compromised secret, because I'd be really curious to know how long can somebody go and do damage before I get notified and can go and remediate it.
Please don't put a valuable one in there.
What do you talk? I'll just go do exactly what the portal tells me, which is AZADSP create for RBAC and give it all rights to everything. Problem solved.
Yeah, global admin's a good one. It's really easy. You don't have to worry about managing permissions then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, it's just like when the firewalls are broken, the best thing to do is just get rid of the firewalls. I mean, clearly that's the right path. But no, we'll do it with one of the demo, one of the Microsoft developer tenants. You too can go get a free Microsoft Azure AD Entra Azure Active Directory developer tenant. It's a mouthful. You can go get a free one. We've got links that have been all over this site, this show for 2 years now, but we'll make sure to get the link out if you want to go get one. We'll go create a secret in there tomorrow, everybody, and we'll put it up in GitHub, and then we'll come and report back how long before it gets blocked. So we had a couple questions. I think you answered most of them sort of naturally already. One thing was around sort of multi-tenant apps, and I'm assuming multi-tenant apps, at least for today, are those in scope for some of the work? Because that feels like it'd get a little weird with multi-tenant apps.
Yeah, it depends on how predictable that IP range is going to be.
Yeah.
I think you'd have to probably give it a try.
Because it seems like, because I would assume the SaaS developer, whoever's building something with a multi-tenant app, would they be the ones that would want to put protections in, or would it be the customer of that SaaS app? I would believe it would be the customer, and that would be a service principal for them, right? But it would be sort of it's a managed service principal. It's not managed, but it's created from a multi-tenant app. So I don't know.
Certainly much more straightforward if it's a single tenant application. It would be much more difficult to do it for multi-tenant. We'll take a look. Be a bit more dynamic, right?
Yeah, we'll take a look. SD Rouge. I don't know how to pronounce your name, and I'm sorry if I've butchered it, which I'm sure I have. But yeah, so we'll be back. I think we're going to do some Twitter Spaces tomorrow to talk about the same thing at noon Eastern. And we've got some shows coming up in the next couple of weeks. We're going to have one of these about. Okay, thank you, Stefan. We got some shows coming up next week. We're going to do workload identities for developers. So we'll look at things like identity federation with GitHub and AKS clusters and whatever, which should be pretty neat. We'll try to do more dangerous things like what we're going to do later this week with putting secrets in GitHub. And then we're going to cap the whole thing off in early August with a workshop so we can kind of get your hands dirty on going through logs, digging through the logs with Graph or with PowerShell, and digging through creating conditional access policies, etc., through Graph, and then also reviewing access with access review. So I think it'll be pretty neat. We got a good month coming up. So anything you want to leave everybody with, Ilana?
No, this has been awesome. It's fun to talk about this stuff. I think it's easy to ignore the population, the identity population here, that and there's a bunch of scary stuff that can happen there. And so I'm really excited by the work we're doing to expand out the scenarios where we can use these identities, and then to help people manage, secure, and govern them. It makes our whole ecosystem better. So this is incredibly exciting, and I hope everyone will give it a try, because this is like really valuable work. And I think that, service principals, it's a tough concept, right? And so, like, the kind of people who understand, hey, this is a thing, and then understand it well enough to understand this is a thing that can be an attack surface. And then, hey, I know enough about the products that my organization uses to realize I have options to keep these secure. Like we're starting to funnel down to a pretty small set of people, and it's probably just about
Yes.
everybody who's watching this show right now, right? And so
Yep.
I think it's incredibly important we're protecting these populations of identities. And so like definitely highly encourage folks to go out and kick their tires there, give us a bunch of feedback. We're obviously, this is something we're investing more and more in, and so anyways we continue to build that out, and people give us feedback and feature requests, things like that. It'd be great.
Well, now's the time for feedback, because there's a whole team of people listening wanting to know with bated breath what all of you think of this. And since all of you are the ones who can tell me the difference between an app registration and an enterprise app, you are the ones who understand how to use this and should go out and try it. Tell us what everything is. So
yeah, all 3.5 people who understand enterprise apps versus app reg.
I saw a new doc article the other day, and it was part of the Workload Identities doc set, which I'm sure is why it got updated. And it was talking about the difference between enterprise apps and app registrations, and it was probably one of the clearest explanations I've seen. And it was only like 5 paragraphs, which is a great cut down from the three pages it used to be. So anyway, we're going to go right over into Mr. Fritz, because he's building something with C#, which I guess is kind of his thing. So we're going to go over there in just a few seconds. In the interim, go out and try these things. Let us know. We'll be back later this week. Everybody knows how to find us and where to find us. And thanks for joining us, Alana. As always, thank you. And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, bye.
See ya.